Okay, let's jump in here. Alrighty, so there we go. Oh, okay. What? Oops, I know what I did. That's what I did. My bad. All right, so we're going to keep talking about deviance and crime here today. Stream is up. Everything is going. One last class before reading week, so it's a good time. What was the average for the midterm? I want to say it's about 78%. I don't remember now. What's my expert opinion on Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin? I mean, okay, I don't want to get too deep into it. It was a very, I've been listening to Putin, honestly, I've been listening to Putin talk since 2001. Nothing he said was particularly different or controversial, right? Controversial, but nothing different. This has been Putin since Putin came into power in 1999. He's been saying similar kinds of things. This whole narrative is well known. There was nothing in there that really surprised me. I thought Carlson came off rather badly in the exchange. He didn't really push Putin very hard on most things. I didn't think he did a great job as an interviewer, but it seemed to me like a very rehearsed kind of presentation by a guy who's been doing the same shtick for a long time. I personally think Putin looks a little bit deranged in some ways, like this obsession with history, does not, to me, suggest good things. I know if you compare him to, say, Joe Biden, he seems like a super genius. But yeah, I wasn't impressed. And honestly, it's things I've heard before from Putin. Nothing surprised me in what he said. And it's that straight up Russian narrative that they've been sort of promoting, really since the middle part of the 2000s. So nothing, at least since 2008. So I didn't find it too surprising. And apparently Putin's not very happy with Carlson's interview. And I don't know. So I care quite little about it. But I did watch the whole 2-hour thing. It was, what it was. Okay. All right, so we ended off last time with I call it my silly hair-based examples of deviance. I'm being slightly glib there because I actually think they're interesting because they demonstrate in lots of ways how even things that we might think are relatively, unserious, right? Like wearing your hair in the samurai style in the Middle Ages or in medieval Japan, in certain kind of cultural contexts, these can be considered quite serious. So deviance, right, what you might consider a small thing in your place and time, in a different place and time, they can be really, really serious. Okay, so we talk about measuring crime, right? So measuring crime as we do it in Canada, and this is mostly true in places like the US as well. The bulk of what you see in terms of crime reporting basically comes in the form of what you call uniform crime reports or uniform crime statistics. So this is what's gathered, say, by the Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics, which is part of Statistics Canada. And basically, they collect things like, police reports. So things like arrest reports, conviction reports, they go to the courts, they go to corrections, and they collect those statistics from official kind of bodies that deal with crime. And these are your uniform crime statistics. So when you talk about, say, the murder rate in Canada, right, you're getting the statistics of what the police have reported as murders, right? Or thefts, or property crime, violent crime, all of these things. These are typically uniform crime statistics. And when you talk about, people will say, oh, the crime rate has risen or the crime rate has fallen since, this particular period, you're talking about official reported statistics. However, there are two other kinds of statistics that we often look at as sociologists to try and get a better sense of what crime actually looks like. And the reason is that a lot of crime ultimately doesn't get reported. So, and particularly, there are times where people simply won't report crimes. This happens, in urban areas in particular, where people don't trust the police, or a gang or other criminal group is particularly powerful, and people don't trust that the police are going to be able to protect them, or if they go to the police, right, they might face consequences, so stuff doesn't get reported. But there's that, and things sometimes like sexual assault get reported at very low rates compared to their severity, often because people may be uncertain as to whether what they experienced was sexual assault. This is really common, right? Women will either think that they, were somehow prompting a behavior, or that somehow, it wasn't sexual assault, and only sometime later, they come to the realization that it was sexual assault. This is a really common experience. And by then, right, they feel like it's too late to report things. But there's also, a couple of other things. One of them is victimless crimes, right? So victimless crimes basically occur when, to put it pretty succinctly, there is no victim to the crime, right? Now, the most common ones are things where, either only one party was taking part in a crime, right? So the consumption of drugs, right, is a pretty common one. So you are consuming drugs, that is technically illegal, right? So let's say you're doing heroin. Technically, it is illegal. However, there's no victim in the crime because you are doing it to yourself and you are consenting. Other types of victimless crimes is where you have two or more parties that are all consenting to, a particular criminal action. This is really common with, say, sex work, right? So sex work, prostitution, whatever you want to call it, is illegal, right? So, we're not talking, sex work sometimes gets overconstrued. We're not talking about OnlyFans. OnlyFans isn't illegal. But let's say like actual street level prostitution, or, selling or soliciting sexual services. Both sides of that equation are a crime, right? It's illegal to engage in prostitution, and it is illegal to solicit prostitution, right? So trying to get the services and providing the services are both illegal. But it rarely gets reported. Why? Well, because both parties are, at least in theory, consenting, right? So, you have nothing to do over reading week, so you go find yourself a prostitute. I feel like that's a terribly common experience. No, I'm kidding. I just didn't want to use myself as an example for obvious reasons, right? Not the least of which is I'm super busy over reading week and have no time for prostitutes. Sorry, I'm kidding. But you go and you find yourself a sex worker, you engage in sexual activity with them, you pay them. Neither of you is going to report that as a crime because both of you participated willingly, and it was, in some senses, a mutually beneficial exchange. You got sex, they got money, and you're both hopefully happy with what happened there. Same thing with drug dealing, right? So both the kind of purchasing of drugs from a drug dealer and the drug dealer selling, I'm going to sneeze. All right, I fought it off. The drug dealer selling you, whatever, Molly or heroin or, something laced with fentanyl. Both of those things are illegal. But again, you're both consenting. So unless, someone observes you, it's unlikely that you're going to get reported or they're going to get reported because, both people in the crime are technically participants. So that's victimless crime. And then, of course, there is the fact that sometimes, crimes get something might still be on the books as a crime, but ultimately either people stop considering it a crime and therefore stop reporting it, or even law enforcement sometimes will start treating certain things criminally in different ways. So, I always think of marijuana use prior to legalization as one of these examples, right? Prior to the legalization of marijuana, consuming marijuana was widely popular. People consumed a lot of marijuana. You could go on a walk, as I often did, in my suburban neighborhood, and you would smell weed in the air as people were smoking it in their backyards and, in public parks and all of these sorts of things, right? Now, most people didn't consider that anymore a serious enough crime to phone the police, and the police had sort of become tolerant of marijuana consumption to the point where they really weren't going to chase down every person who was smoking weed, even in public, simply because it was like not worth their time. It wasn't likely to get a conviction. They weren't going to get anything out of it, so why bother, right? So we have things that might be considered crimes that aren't ultimately prosecuted as crimes. I could go on, but actually that's probably enough for the moment. Okay. So how do we get at some of these things, right? Some of these different types of crimes that don't get reported. Sometimes they call it the dark shadow of crime, right? Where basically we know there's a lot of crime that goes on that doesn't get picked up by official statistics. And there's usually two ways that sociologists and criminologists specifically try to measure this. The first one is self-report surveys. So usually these are, so basically, typically as part of a larger social science survey, something where you're asking a broad set of questions to people, you might include some questions about whether they have committed or been, either been involved in crime or been the victim of crime, right? In the past, whatever, 6 months, year and a half, whatever it happens to be, right? So basically, you would send out a survey, I don't know, like something like the general social survey, where you ask people a bunch of questions and you ask them questions about whether they've committed certain categories of crime. This is a self-report, right? So these surveys are always anonymous, right? Otherwise, no one would fill them out. Otherwise, it would be just too handy a tool for the police to use to get information about who's committing crimes and when. But basically, people will report that, maybe they had a minor break-in or someone broke into their car and they didn't bother. They smoke drugs, they've bought drugs, they've engaged in soliciting sex work, all of these sorts of things of their own accord, basically, through these self-report surveys. Okay, so that's one. Victimization surveys are another one. And again, typically done as part of these a larger social science survey, right? Something where you're trying to find out bigger sets of information, and you ask questions about whether people have been the victims of particular types of crime. And again, always anonymous, always trying to figure out whether there's been victimization. And again, trying to figure out what doesn't get reported, right? What doesn't get told to police, so we can figure out, A, who's being victimized by particular types of crime, how often these crimes happen that aren't reported, and all of these sorts of things. Because we know that there's much more crime that happens than we actually know about at the end of the day. Okay. This is a fun one, I think. So, don't worry, you'll have a week to heal your cough in a moment. So, police-reported crimes, basically 1962 to 2013. What's really notable, and this trend slightly reversed after 2020, but the general trend is in the same direction, is most crimes, right? If we look at overall crime, like our total crime in blue, and our property crimes in red, they sort of hit their peak at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, right? So if we go back to the 1960s, relatively low levels of crime overall. It really spikes, following the 1960s, in a pretty straight up trajectory, tops out right about here, and then declines steadily for both total crime and property crime, which property crime by far the most common type of crime. That's break-ins, muggings. I guess muggings are violent crime. Never mind. So break-ins, theft of property, break-ins to automobiles, grand theft auto, all of these things considered types of property crime. When we look at other crimes, right, things that aren't either violent crime or property crime, they kind of go up as well, not as high, and then sort of flatten out after the kind of 1989, 1990. And then violent crimes never go as high, and they've sort of stayed pretty flat. But basically, we see a big decline in crime starting right about there, right where my little arrow is, so right here. And it's basically gone down, down, down. It kind of peaks up again in 2020. And there's been a little bit of an upsurge, but we don't know the end point of that just yet. But even past 2013, it kept going down basically till about 2020. Canada has this weird measure that's called the Crime Severity Index. It's put together by the Centre for Justice Statistics, or the Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics, the CCJS, out of Revenue Canada. Maybe you get revenue from crime. I meant Statistics Canada. And basically what we see is that, so the Crime Severity Index is basically a way of trying to measure not just, total crime, but how serious that crime is, right? There's a bunch of metrics like when it comes to property crime, you're talking about, the amount of damage done, the worth in dollars of something stolen. When you talk about violent crime, it's, how violent it is overall, how much harm was caused. Obviously, if someone's murdered, that is a much more severe crime than if someone is mugged. And what we see kind of generally is that using this metric from Statistics Canada, we've seen a kind of general decline in the severity of crime, of all kinds of crime, essentially since the 1990s, right? And so they start putting this number together in 1998, so we don't have statistics that go beyond 1998, but Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics starts to compile what's called the Crime Severity Index in 1998. So we've seen decline in the severity of crimes up until about 2014, at which point it takes a little uptick. And there's another uptick in 2020, but I couldn't find a good graph for it. So yeah, the severity of crimes were declining as well. So generally, even though sometimes we have the sense that, Canada has been getting to be a more dangerous place, it's still a much safer place with much lower crime today than it was, say at the end of the 1980s. Okay, so the question is always why? Why has crime declined, in the post-1980s period? Why do we see, both total amount of crime and the severity of crime dropping? And now this is broadly the case in most Western democracies, right? The United States, although we think of it as a haven for criminality and violence, we've seen similar overall declines in crime in the US in most cases. I mean, obviously more gun violence because they have a lot more guns, but generally, the number of crimes and the crime severity has been declining in the US as well. So why? And there's basically been 4 arguments that have been put forward. I could maybe add a 5th one, because the 5th one is fun, and I always forget to add it. I'll just write it. All right, we'll talk about that one. But basically, there's 4 main ones, and then the 5th one that I'm just tacking on as to why crime has declined overall. Okay, so the one that I think is probably the most correct is number 1, right? Basically, what happens in response to, after the 1960s, we get a huge growth in the crime rate. And so what ends up happening is it takes a little while, but eventually we get, society sort of reacts to it. It takes a while because society is pretty slow, but they build up essentially an infrastructure of criminal justice institutions and personnel that's able to deal with surging crime. So one of the things that happens, right, a lot more police are recruited. Police forces get larger and larger from 1960 up until the 1980s. And so what ends up happening is that they get much better at catching crime. Now, there's some argument that as police forces grow, they catch more criminals, and it actually causes an increase in the reported crime rate, right? Because if more police officers are out there looking for crime, they're going to catch more people, which will drive that curve up until people basically get so afraid that they stop committing crimes. What happens from the 60s to the end of the 80s, you get this huge increase in the infrastructure of criminal justice, both police and then correctional officers, and more prisons built, and all of these sorts of things. And so you get a kind of decrease in the crime rate after that, a point where it sort of reaches a saturation. The police get so good at catching people, they put all the people, or not all the people obviously, but a large number of the people who commit crimes in prison. That reduces the total number of people who can commit crimes that are out in society, and society gets more peaceful. Also, the more likely you are to get caught, the less likely you are to actually go and commit crimes. There's a deterrence factor, so you commit crimes, there's less crime committed because people are more afraid of getting caught. So as you get better trained, better equipped law enforcement and correctional kind of systems, crime will increase for a while as you catch all the people who are committing crimes and then decrease. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, young men are the most prone to committing crimes. So, I mean, the profile of people who commit crimes, right? It's about 80% male, roughly. And the largest number of those, who commit those crimes are aged about 15 to about 25, right? So it's young men in particular that commit the most crimes across the board: property crimes, violent crimes, all that stuff, right? Young men between 15 and 25, roughly. So what happened, in the 1960s, and why, if we look at this curve of rising crime, you get basically the tail end of the silent generation, but particularly the beginning of this demographic I talked to you about, I think last time or two classes ago, of the baby boomers, right? Where you had, in Canada, 8.6 million babies born, and in the US, 76 million babies born. About half of those should be male, right? Coming into the population, or into the kind of teenage and young adult population, pretty close to right here, right? And it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as we move through into the 1980s, where most of them then will get out of that, so by, I guess it starts in 1940, the baby boom starts in 1945, so by 1965, the first of the baby boomers are going to be 20, and then, as you move through, the big part of the demographic will move through. The last of the baby boomers is about 1965, so they should be mostly through by the kind of end point of the 1990s, right? And this is a huge demographic with lots and lots of young men in it. So lots of young men as a percentage of the population, lots of crime just by the statistics. And so what we see is exactly what we would expect, right? As you have a big demographic chunk of young men in the population, you see crime. I know I've drawn so many lines you can't tell what I'm doing anymore, but you see crime go up. And as those young men hit kind of around 23, 25, you start to see crime go back down, right? It's exactly what we would expect to happen based on this kind of argument. And so I think this has a lot of merit to it as well, because it basically fits the time ordering really, really well, right? It makes a ton of sense that this is the overall time order of the drop in crime. So lots of young men, but as Canada gets older, as the baby boomers move into essentially late, like emerging adulthood, and then into sort of the 30s and then middle age, you continue to see big declines in crime. And because the baby boomers had so few children, basically every generation after that is kind of smaller. So you don't see a big increase in crime, because just as a percentage will tend to go down. Okay, so young men most prone to crime. Sorry, I keep checking if there's questions. And as the population ages and the youth population declines, crime declines as well, which kind of makes sense. So I think these are both very likely options. So number three, economic conditions favored a decrease in crime. This one I think is bullshit, but it's one of those explanations that's offered anyway. So, amongst other things, right, one of the ideas is that people commit crimes because they're poor and they lack opportunities. Now, I think that's basically incorrect. The reasons people commit crimes are actually pretty complicated. Obviously not every poor person commits crimes, and not every rich person doesn't commit crimes. Actually, it's much more mixed than that. But basically, the argument is when people had legitimate opportunities, essentially starting in the 1980s, the economy got better after a recession in the 70s. You should see basically decreasing crime, because instead of supporting yourself through crime, you support yourself through legitimate means. Now, again, I think this doesn't really make sense, because like this period from about 1962 to about 1973 was actually a really good economic time, lots of opportunity. So you should have seen, if that was the explanation, crime should have been sort of flatter. I'm going to draw a line of a different color. That's what I'm going to do. Blue, right? Crime should have been kind of flat. And then in 1973, when the economy gets bad, then you would see crime go up. When it gets better in 1989, it would go back down. That's not really what we see. We saw a steady increase in crime. But that's the sort of argument, right? Economic conditions, as the economy gets better, you see crime rise. We also didn't see it in 2008, right? 2008, the economy gets really bad again. They call it the Great Recession, and crime didn't increase overall. So I think that argument is mostly kind of stupid. I will tell you exactly how I feel about it, however. I think it's dumb. The last one is actually, or I guess the fourth one, is one of my favorites. So basically, this, again, this kind of has to do with number 2, right? So 4 and 2 are kind of linked in the sense. And I guess 4, 3, and 2 would be kind of linked in this way, right? But basically the idea is that once abortion is legalized, you should see a decline in crime, because if it's poor people committing the crimes, we know that poor women have far more abortions than richer women, because the question is about whether they can support their children. So you would have less, once they can get abortions, they're going to have less poor children, especially poor young men, and therefore be less able to commit crimes, right? Now, this is, I think, sometimes referred to as the Freakonomics argument, because this is the argument that was made in Freakonomics, basically that legalized abortion is good for law and order because it reduces the number of young males who might be inclined to commit crimes, and therefore they are never born, so they can never commit crimes, right? It's a sort of weird eugenics-y type argument, but there it is. Now, I mean, this kind of makes sense in some senses in the US, right? So the landmark case that leads to the legalization of abortion in the US is obviously Roe v. Wade, which happens in 1973. So if you kind of fast forward that about 15 years, right, you end up at 1998, or wait, yes, 1985 plus 5, 85, sorry, about 1990, sorry. 73, yes, about a little bit before, 1988, 1990. So you roughly end up, I can do math, it's just Friday before reading week. You roughly end up kind of where this curve that we see, although this is Canada, ends up, right? You see a start to the decline in crime, kind of around the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. And so, plausibly you could say that it kind of fits the time ordering of causation, right? You get a decline in crime roughly 15 to 20 years after abortion is legalized. Now, I mean, when you dig deeper into the statistics, you find that actually it doesn't 100% work even in the US, because the number of abortions rises over time and rises considerably later than the decline in crime, right? So still the total number of abortions, like in the range where you're seeing it decline, is still relatively low. And even here, right, it doesn't quite fit the time ordering. In Canada, though, it doesn't fit at all, because in Canada, abortion isn't legalized until, in Canada, abortion isn't actually legalized until, where's my red pen? Right here, 1983, right? In a case called Morgentaler v. Crown. So abortion is, so basically here, if you were looking at the Canadian numbers, the big decline shouldn't be right here. That's way too early. It should be like more, over here. So you get a sharp decline in crime way before you get abortion's legalization and the consequences of that in society, right? So I don't think it works for Canada. It kind of half makes sense for the United States. All right, the last one, and my favorite one, the one sometimes people bring up, is lead. So in the 1990s, again, I don't think this one works because of the time ordering. In the 1990s, or late 1980s, early 1990s, Canada and the US in particular ban lead additives in two things: paint, right? So up until the 1980s, people used to add lead to paint, and to fuel, right? Oil companies added lead to gasoline, which is why if you go to the pump today, right, it says that the gasoline is unleaded, because at one point when I was a kid, gasoline was leaded, right? It had lead in it. And so, you burn the leaded fuel and you had lead kind of flying around in the atmosphere all over the place. Lead makes you stupid, to put it gently. It's a heavy metal, it builds up, and it impairs neurocognitive function and development. So people who have high amounts of lead in childhood will often show cognitive delays. Cognitive delays, low IQ, does tend to be correlated to criminality, right? Because if you can't support yourself by getting a job because your IQ is too low, right? You're not able to learn tasks, you have a bunch of cognitive delays, you theoretically turn to crime to support yourself. Now again, I think the time ordering is a bit off on this because the timing where they, bless you. I hope no one sneezed at home. I did that one time where someone sneezed in class and I said, bless you. And then someone put in the Slido that I freaked them out because they sneezed at home. And then they were like, how did you know? So we'll see. But yeah, basically lead, once we ban it, you stop seeing as many of those cognitive delays, right? You see less lead-based effects on people's neurodevelopment. And so you should see a decline in criminality. Again, I think this is an argument that's been offered. I think the timing is a bit off on that one as well, but it definitely is one of the theories that's been in contention. Yeah, it's kind of cold in here, actually. It's weird. It's nice. I'm sure after reading week, they'll crank up, but it's cold outside, so maybe they turned the heat down so we'd all freeze to death. I don't know. My first class today was canceled because the fire department showed up to the Fine Arts building because of a fire alarm, so I'm just assuming the whole campus is going to collapse. Okay, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the States, will there be a predicted rise in the crime rate? The answer to your question is we don't know. Because, my crystal ball is on the fritz, and so my ability to predict the future is terrible. Frankly, I always had a bad ability to predict the future. I've picked the wrong Stanley Cup winner every single year. For years, I chose San Jose, and we all know how that turned out. They have never won the cup. But it's possible, but again, we won't see it would be very uneven. This is one of the problems. It would be very uneven because which case is it? It's not Obergefell. Obergefell is a different one. I can't remember the case. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That overturned Roe. But basically, it kicked everything back to the states, right? So different states now have very different abortion legislation. So what you should see is that crime will go up in, say, Florida, which now has a 6-week abortion ban. It should be less so in Texas, which I think has a 12 or 15-week abortion ban. And then you should see almost no difference in California and New York, which still have basically abortion essentially available for all 9 months of pregnancy. So it's going to be very, again, we're not going to see the effects for, 15 to 20 years. And who knows what will happen in the meantime, right? I don't know, when Donald J. Trump becomes president again, or President Biden is president for 8 minutes before dying, and then Kamala Harris takes over, who knows what will happen. Those are the two only scenarios that I think are going to occur. Or maybe Canada invades and Justin Trudeau becomes king of all of North America, who knows. The disorder in the States is such, I almost believe that scenario. But we won't see it for 20 years, and who knows what's going to happen intervening in that time. So the answer to your question is maybe, if the number of births in places with no abortion goes way up, especially to poor people, that would be the Freakonomics kind of argument. So, when you're standing in front of this class teaching, maybe you can be like, my professor told us this when I was taking SOC 100, and now I can rightfully say he was wrong. So we'll go with that. Okay, so yeah, all right. Criminal profiles, right? Basically, as of 2013, for adult crimes, right, you see this 80-20 split that I told you. 80% of crimes are committed by men, about 20% committed by women. If you look at the skew for violent crimes, it's even more abrupt. It's about 90-10, right? Men commit way more violent crimes than women do. In youth court, right, so amongst youth, you have many more young women. Well, a slightly less skewed percentage, although you can still see, right, it's about 74% of the cases are males versus about 26% of females in Canada. Now, this is probably a bit of an exaggeration in the sense that one of the things that happens in the Canadian justice system, we have this legislation called the Youth Criminal Justice Act, or the YCJA. And one of the principles of it is diversion, right? That we don't want to put young people in prison. And for a bunch of reasons that you can go and take Brian Hogavine's Youth Crime and Society class if you're interested, men are diverted at a far higher rate than women are. So even though men are still committing more crimes in this age bracket, right? Like basically 12 to 18, males commit more crimes. Women are charged with crimes at a slightly higher rate than they would once they get to adulthood. So there's some skewing around in the process. Okay, and yeah, this cohort 15 to 24, 15 to 25 is the one where we see most criminality, right? It'll basically kind of start to rise at about 12 really slowly, get into its peak at about, towards its peak at about 15, peaks at about 18, 19, and then starts to go down after that. And by the time you hit like 40, you're basically at a kind of flat line. You know, barely anyone is committing crimes in their 40s, right? It's pretty pronounced. It's pretty predictable. Oh, and I have my Riverdale picture there. Oh, Riverdale. You started so promisingly and became such a nonsense TV show. I miss you. I loved Riverdale in the early days. It was such a weird show. And then it became complete nonsense with like magical witches and all this bullshit. It really went bad. Okay, so racial bias in the Canadian justice system is sort of well known. Canada and the US both have racial biases in their criminal justice systems, right? So if we look at, Indigenous people, despite making up less than 5% of the Canadian population, we see about 25% of the total inmate population. Now, that's Canada-wide. If we look at the prairies in particular, and Manitoba's especially bad. Sometimes it's up to 80 to 85% of the population in prisons is Indigenous. And I've heard anecdotally, though I haven't checked, and I really should check, that there are women's prisons in Saskatchewan and Manitoba that are 100% Indigenous, right? That basically all of the inmates are Indigenous people. So a huge skew in terms of who gets arrested and charged. Again, I've heard that anecdotally, and I hang out with criminologists all the time, so I kind of trust them. So, we'll go with that. In terms of black people, right, only 3% of the population of Canada is black, but they make up about 10% of the prison population, and that's been rising, right? So basically, for black people, it's gone up about 42%. For Indigenous people, 39%. And then for Caucasians, or white people, right, it's decreased by 14.9%, while the prison population has risen about 5%, right? So there's definitely kind of disparities in who ends up in prison in Canada towards Indigenous and black people ending up in prison at far higher rates. So why this overrepresentation? The principal one that's been proffered is poverty, right? Indigenous people on average have lower incomes. They're more likely to be poor than Canadians as a whole, and that does obviously potentially play into some form of committing certain types of crime, right? The propensity for committing certain types of crime is definitely larger. They also make up, a greater percentage of the homeless population. So you have that as well. And obviously, if you are on the street or street involved, you're much more likely to be committing crimes in some way, and therefore much more likely to end up getting arrested and incarcerated. Okay, they tend to commit more street crimes. So street crimes as opposed to what are called white-collar crimes, right? So street crimes are basically crimes that happen typically. So they don't. You'll see questions like this on the midterm, on the next midterm, where they're going to trick you. Typically, they happen out on the street, or they're kind of at the street level, right? But they're typically, more crimes that would be typical of the street, even if, say, they happen inside of a building. So things like selling drugs, right, would be a street crime. Even if you're selling drugs out of your basement, right, or your mom's basement or whatever, that's still a street crime technically. Breaking and entering, muggings, assaults, robberies, all of these things are, stealing cars, all of these things are considered street crimes or street level crimes. Why? Because they typically happen in very public places. Now, white collar crimes are a little bit different. White collar crimes, right, we call them that because they're typically done by, people in white collar jobs. So things like embezzlement, copyright infringement, white collar crime, embezzlement, internet fraud, right? All of these sorts of things are all, hacking. All of these things are considered white collar crimes because typically they're done off the street, right, by people who are specialized. And they tend to be charged at much lower rates, even though, they tend to actually be more economically disruptive than street level crimes. So, yeah, basically Indigenous and Black people in Canada, and then Black people and Latino people in the US tend to commit more street level crimes that are more likely to be caught by the police, so they end up in prison more often. Discrimination by the justice system, both more police attention to minority neighborhoods and the fact that courts have tended to sentence people of minority backgrounds at higher rates and to longer sentences also plays a role in this. And especially when you're young, right? Bless you. Everything's falling apart. Especially when you're young, if you end up in the criminal justice system, you're much more likely to reoffend through your life. The goal typically is to keep people out of prisons. We'll talk about that when we talk about recidivism. Okay, and then, this is especially, true of Indigenous people. Weakened social control over community members due to colonialism, right? Western culture's disruption of their communities and things like intergenerational trauma, right? So this is the legacy of colonialism, things like the residential schools and the 60 scoops, disrupted Indigenous communities, sort of damaged Indigenous culture in some ways, made it hard for people to connect, left Indigenous communities in a lot of cases without means to support themselves, which has led to more Indigenous people, being in kind of desperate circumstances, being the victims of things like abuse, substance abuse in particular, to the point where they often are struggling. Did that person come in now just to use the garbage? What a weird thing to do. Like, that was odd. Okay. Never had that happen before. Just come up and slap me in the face, why don't you? All right. All right, I can I talk? Oh, this is like 2 slides that go together. It's going to take more than 3 minutes. Oh, all right, I'm going to say this really quickly, and then I'm going to let you go. So, deviant behavior, right, is not something that people do naturally. Criminologists will tell you that it is learned, right? You learn criminal behavior by interacting with other people. And basically, for symbolic interactionists, when they want to talk about criminality or deviance and try to stop it, they want to identify the circumstances that promote the learning of deviant and criminal behavior and try to interrupt that cycle. I can do this really super fast. One of the things that was noted, right, so Becker, who's an interactionist in 1963, wanted to know how people learn to enjoy smoking weed. And what he said is most people, if you just gave them a joint, they wouldn't immediately enjoy it, but you learn the behaviors that go with smoking weed and enjoying it through other people, right? So you learn to smoke it in a way that produces something other than you just coughing up a lung, right? How to smoke it so you get the maximum effects. You learn to recognize what those feelings are. You start getting the munchies, and then you learn how to enjoy those sensations. And this is true of most substance use, right? When you learn to drink, you usually learn, how much to drink, what it feels like with other people, so you learn these deviant behaviors with others. All right, we'll pick it up from here on Monday after the break. Have a great reading week. We will see you then. Hello again.